Have you ever wondered what really happens behind the blinding lights, the deafening screams of millions, and the insanely grueling schedules of the world's biggest boy band? We constantly see them breaking global records on massive stages, but who actually grounds these 7 superstars when the curtains finally close? Behind their untouchable fame lies a deeply emotional secret weapon keeping them completely sane. What is the one thing they absolutely must do, no matter how physically exhausted they are? Who are the real queens holding the true hearts of these global icons? Prepare yourselves, because we are about to dive deep. Number 7. RM, the heavy crown, the ultimate comfort. Have you ever stopped to genuinely imagine the crushing, suffocating, yet brilliantly glowing weight of carrying the title of leader for the biggest, most influential music phenomenon on the face of the planet? We are talking about Kim Namjoon, globally known as RM, the man who confidently stood before the United Nations, flawlessly delivered deeply philosophical speeches that moved millions across the globe, casually shook hands with world presidents, and constantly serves as the sturdy, unbreakable pillar for 6 other massive superstars. But when the roaring, deafening cheers of 80,000 ecstatic fans at Wembley Stadium finally fade into the eerie, ringing silence of a luxury hotel room, who exactly does the great leader turn to when his own broad shoulders begin to feel incredibly heavy? The reality is as breathtaking as it is profoundly human, because no matter if he is crossing multiple dizzying time zones, buried under endless agonizing studio sessions, or mentally completely exhausted from the relentless high-stakes demands of the global press, Namjoon always relentlessly carves out a pocket of time to call his mother, the very woman who was initially his biggest hurdle before ultimately becoming his absolute strongest shield in a chaotic world. Let's rewind time a bit to a young, exceptionally brilliant teenage Namjoon who actually ranked in the top 1.3% of the entire nation for his incredibly difficult mock university exams. His mother, desperately holding on to the completely understandable and fiercely protective dreams of a highly secure, prestigious academic future for her undisputed genius of a son, was aggressively opposed to his underground hip-hop aspirations, even going as far as secretly destroying his microphone and hiding his computer keyboard to forcefully redirect his attention back to his textbooks. But do you know what singular moment completely changed the entire trajectory of modern music history? It was that single, incredibly vulnerable and razor-sharp question he asked her while standing right at the terrifying crossroads of his destiny, looking her in the eye and asking, "Mom, would you rather have a son who is a first-place rapper or a 5,000th place student?" That profound, emotionally charged moment of raw honesty did not just win her over, it forged an unbreakable, deeply intellectual, and fiercely loyal bond between a mother and her son that beautifully survives the absolute madness of his current reality. And this deeply rooted history is exactly why those late-night phone calls are so fundamentally crucial to his survival in the cutthroat music industry today. When he picks up that smartphone in the dead of night, the highly intimidating, fiercely charismatic aura of RM the superstar instantly melts away, effortlessly stripping him down to just Namjoon, the thoughtful, endlessly curious, nature-loving young man who just desperately wants to talk about his latest beloved bonsai plant, a brand new obscure indie artist he just discovered, or the profound hidden meaning behind a contemporary abstract painting he saw during a secret museum visit, because his mother is not just his parent, she is his ultimate intellectual equal and his safest emotional sanctuary in a world that constantly demands pieces of his soul. Can you even begin to fathom the intense, overwhelming comfort he must feel when her familiar, warm voice travels through the receiver from thousands of miles away, completely ignoring the prestigious Billboard charts, the record-breaking sales, and the historic Grammy nominations, and instead simply genuinely asking if he has eaten a proper hot meal today or if his back is still hurting from the grueling, body-breaking choreography? We often see tiny, heart-wrenching snippets of this grueling reality in raw documentaries like Burn the Stage or Break the Silence, where the sheer physical and mental toll of performing back-to-back sold-out stadium shows leaves him literally gasping for air on the cold, unforgiving backstage floor, requiring emergency oxygen masks and ice packs just to survive the next 3-minute song. But what the professional cameras rarely manage to capture is that immediate, desperate, reflexive reach for his phone the very moment he makes it back to the absolute deafening isolation of his hotel suite. It is in those painfully quiet, deeply lonely hours of the night when the concert adrenaline violently crashes and leaves behind nothing but an echoing, bone-deep exhaustion that dialing her familiar number becomes his most vital survival mechanism, acting as a much-needed grounding anchor to his own fragile humanity. You can actually hear the profound, lasting impact of her nurturing presence echoing directly through his deeply poetic songwriting and his highly introspective solo projects, where he constantly wrestles with the complex duality of his existence, desperately trying to reconcile the massive, untouchable, godlike entity of RM with the fragile, constantly learning, wildly imperfect human being named Kim Namjoon. His mother has profoundly shaped this beautiful philosophical outlook. When he passionately speaks to the confused global youth about unconditionally loving themselves and bravely finding their own unique voice, it's almost impossible not to trace those deeply empowering sentiments directly back to the very woman who eventually learned to fiercely protect his voice when he first decided to boldly use it, proving once and for all that her initial strict resistance was never about suffocating his wild dreams, but rather a terrifyingly deep, primal motherly love rooted in a desperate desire to shield him from the cruel, soul-crushing unpredictability of the entertainment industry. Now standing tall as the undisputed, highly respected king of a massive musical empire, his precious conversations with her are no longer about desperately proving his worth or begging for validation, but rather about fiercely maintaining his absolute sanity in a hypercritical world that constantly tries to put him on an impossible, flawless, exhausting pedestal. Imagine the intense, dizzying psychological whiplash of standing in front of world leaders at the actual White House, eloquently discussing incredibly heavy, historically complex topics like anti-Asian hate crimes and vital global solidarity, and then mere hours later, stepping off that historic, highly publicized podium, sliding into a heavily armored black SUV, and just pulling out your phone to playfully call your mom to hear her excitedly, normally talk about the simple, perfectly ordinary dinner she just cooked back in Seoul. It is this exact staggering, almost unbelievable contrast that keeps his feet so firmly and securely planted on the actual earth, actively preventing his ego from inflating to dangerous heights and powerfully preventing his gentle spirit from entirely shattering under the immense, crushing pressure of his own unprecedented historical success. Think about the countless endearing times he has accidentally broken expensive stage props, carelessly lost high-end designer headphones, or clumsily forgotten his own passport at the airport, rightfully earning him the affectionate, hilarious nickname God of Destruction from his teasing members and adoring fans. Yet through his mother's eyes, he is absolutely not the brilliant, multi-millionaire leader of a global phenomenon, but rather her sweet, slightly absent-minded, hopelessly clumsy boy who still desperately needs to be gently reminded to dress warmly when the harsh, freezing winter seasons suddenly change in South Korea. This deeply intimate, incredibly grounding, and beautifully ordinary reality makes you truly, profoundly appreciate the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of these international phone calls, serving as a powerfully emotional reminder that no matter how breathtakingly monumental a person's historical achievements may be, the primal, deeply ingrained human need for a mother's unwavering validation and her calming, comforting reassurance never, ever actually fades, regardless of how many millions of people are screaming your name. Number 6. Jin, the worldwide handsome, the ultimate bragging right. Have you ever stopped to truly consider the incredibly profound, deeply moving origin story behind the man who confidently introduces himself to the entire world as worldwide handsome, playfully blowing his signature kisses to millions of screaming fans while flashing a flawlessly confident smile that could easily light up the darkest and most intimidating of global arenas? We're talking about Kim Sek-jin, the eldest brother, the undeniable visual, and the incredibly hard-working silver vocalist of BTS, a man who effortlessly commands the absolute attention of the global media with his stunning looks and his incredibly witty, rapid-fire humor. But behind this perfectly crafted, hilarious, and larger-than-life extroverted persona lies a deeply sensitive, incredibly touching, and fundamentally family-oriented motivation that will absolutely bring tears to your eyes the moment you realize its true depth. To genuinely understand the sheer magnitude of Jin's desperate, unwavering need to constantly call his mother, no matter how physically drained, emotionally exhausted, or time-deprived he is after a grueling 14-hour stadium rehearsal, we have to travel back in time and revisit a highly specific, painfully raw confession he made during the deeply emotional climax of the 2017 BTS Live Trilogy Episode 3, The Wings Tour finale in Seoul. Standing on that massive, blindingly lit stage, looking out at a breathtaking, seemingly endless ocean of tens of thousands of glowing army bombs, Jin completely dropped his usual playful, endlessly joking demeanor, his voice visibly shaking as he bravely revealed a deeply hidden, intimately painful childhood memory that fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of his life. He tearfully confessed to the massive, suddenly completely silent crowd that when he was just a young, highly impressionable boy, he vividly remembered watching his mother quietly sitting in complete silent resignation while her wealthy socialite friends endlessly and enthusiastically bragged about their own son's impressive academic and professional achievements. In that heartbreaking, deeply defining moment, watching his beloved mother utterly unable to say a single word about him, a fierce, burning resolve was instantly ignited within his young heart. He silently promised himself with a sheer, terrifying level of unyielding determination that he would one day become a son she could proudly brag about to the entire world, a son who would finally give her the ultimate, undeniable voice among her peers. And this intensely emotional foundation is exactly why he initially pursued a highly demanding acting degree at the prestigious Jungkook University, only to be unexpectedly scouted by Big Hit Entertainment right off the bustling streets of Seoul simply because of his striking, completely unignorable visuals. Can you even begin to imagine the terrifying, unimaginably painful physical and mental toll it took on a young, ambitious, aspiring actor with absolutely zero background in singing or intense hip-hop dancing to suddenly be thrust into a grueling, incredibly brutal idol training system, desperately struggling to keep up with natural-born musical prodigies like Jimin and J-Hope, while his entire body constantly screamed in agonizing pain? Yet he pushed through the blood, the endless buckets of sweat, and the absolute ocean of silent tears in those claustrophobic, mirror-lined dark practice rooms, constantly fueled by that one singular, relentlessly burning desire to make his mother boundlessly proud, which makes his present-day reality as a historic, record-breaking global superstar all the more poetic and profoundly beautiful. Today, when the explosive, ear-shattering pyrotechnics finally fade and the heavy velvet curtains close on yet another massively successful multi-million-dollar world tour, the very first thing the eldest Hyung of BTS does is reach for his smartphone to dial his mother's number, entirely shedding the heavy, responsible, nurturing role of the protective father figure he constantly plays for his 6 immensely famous younger bandmates. In those deeply intimate late-night international phone calls, the incredibly broad-shouldered, incredibly reliable Kim Sek-jin instantly reverts to being the absolutely adorable, slightly whiny, intensely affection-seeking youngest son of his own family, playfully sharing his notoriously cheesy dad jokes just to hear her familiar, heartwarming laughter beautifully echoing through the receiver from thousands of miles away. It is absolutely fascinating to deeply realize that while the rest of the world fiercely debates his flawless vocal stability, his striking worldwide visuals, or his absolutely staggering net worth, his mother is essentially the only person on the planet who simply asks if he has eaten enough of his favorite warm Korean stews, if he has finally stopped playing his beloved MapleStory video games late into the night, or if he is actually getting enough restorative sleep in between those highly exhausting, high-altitude international flights. These deeply personal, fiercely guarded phone calls are completely non-negotiable for him, whether he is nervously waiting in a highly chaotic, heavily guarded green room at the prestigious Grammy Awards, dealing with the intense global media frenzy following a monumental solo release like his incredibly beautiful, emotionally devastating track The Astronaut, or sitting completely alone in a luxurious, agonizingly silent hotel suite in the heart of London. Talking to his mom is his ultimate, deeply necessary emotional reset button. It acts as an incredibly powerful, deeply grounding anchor, constantly reminding him of the pure, untainted, beautifully simple reasons he started this brutal, terrifying journey in the first place, completely ensuring that the blinding, intoxicating allure of unprecedented global fame never once poisons his deeply humble, incredibly grounded spirit. Imagine the immense, overwhelming wave of pure emotional satisfaction and deep, soulful peace he must feel now, knowing without a single shadow of a doubt that his mother no longer has to sit in quiet, awkward silence during those mundane neighborhood gatherings. Instead, she is universally, fundamentally recognized as the undeniably proud mother of a literal cultural icon, a wildly successful man who gracefully and courageously completed his physically demanding mandatory military service with top honors as an elite assistant drill instructor, completely shattering any ridiculous preconceived celebrity stereotypes. He is a man who continuously breaks unprecedented solo Billboard records, effortlessly commands the absolute respect of the entire global music industry, and has essentially brought unparalleled historic cultural glory to the entire nation of South Korea. Yet, despite literally handing her the entire world on a glittering, diamond-encrusted silver platter, he never once takes her pure, unconditional love for him for granted. He constantly relies on her gentle, deeply grounding wisdom to successfully navigate the highly treacherous, often deeply toxic waters of unprecedented global fame, meticulously making sure that his massive, worldwide ego never once overshadows his deeply ingrained fundamental kindness and his hilariously polite manners. The incredibly profound, spectacularly beautiful irony of Kim Sek-jin's life is that while he constantly takes care of absolutely everyone else around him, cooking delicious hot meals for his members in their desperately poor early dorm days, meticulously checking on their fragile mental health during brutal global schedules, and expertly breaking the ice in highly tense, uncomfortable international interviews with his undeniable charm, it is ultimately his mother who entirely takes care of him, quietly providing the completely invisible, deeply secure emotional safety net that gracefully allows him to fearlessly jump into the terrifying unknown of superstardom every single day. Number 5. Suga, the savage rapper, the secretly soft son. Have you ever stopped to truly analyze the fascinating, deeply complex, and entirely misunderstood dichotomy of the man who literally sets international stages ablaze with his aggressively raw, incredibly fast-paced hip-hop verses, spitting absolute fire as the fierce alter ego August D, yet possesses a remarkably tender heart that he meticulously guards behind an effortlessly cool, notoriously savage exterior? We are diving deep into the intensely emotional, profoundly inspiring world of Min Yoongi, globally known and fiercely revered as Suga, the absolute genius resident producer and deeply introspective lead rapper of BTS, a man who consistently casually brushes off massive global awards and record-breaking Billboard accolades with a calm, unimpressed shrug, but absolutely melts into a puddle of soft, completely unguarded vulnerability the moment his phone screen lights up with his mother's name. To genuinely grasp the sheer, devastating gravity of why his late-night, desperately needed phone calls to his mother are so fundamentally crucial to his emotional survival in the wildly chaotic, utterly ruthless entertainment industry, we absolutely must travel back to the freezing, incredibly difficult underground hip-hop scenes of Daegu, where a young, fiercely ambitious boy named Gloss was desperately trying to sell his original musical beats for mere pennies just to afford a simple bowl of noodles for dinner. His parents, deeply terrified by the notoriously unstable, financially devastating reality of the South Korean music industry, fiercely and aggressively opposed his seemingly impossible musical dreams, going to intensely heartbreaking lengths such as secretly throwing away his precious handwritten lyric notebooks and outright refusing to support his terrifying decision to move to Seoul, not out of malice, but out of a deeply protective, desperately primal parental fear of watching their beloved son starve and suffer in a merciless, hyper-competitive world. Can you even begin to comprehend the immense, agonizingly heavy psychological toll it takes on a desperately struggling, starving young teenager to relentlessly pursue a seemingly impossible dream while simultaneously feeling the completely crushing, profoundly isolating weight of knowing that the two people who brought him into this world entirely disapprove of the one thing that keeps his heart beating? Yet he stubbornly pushed through the unimaginable physical agony of a severely shattered shoulder from a tragic, heavily concealed motorcycle accident, while secretly working as a delivery boy to pay his tuition, silently enduring the blood, the sweat, and the absolute ocean of silent, lonely tears, constantly fueled by an impossibly fierce, burning desire to one day forcefully prove to his parents that his musical genius was not a foolish delusion, but a world-changing destiny. This agonizingly painful, deeply isolating history makes the incredibly raw, completely unscripted moment during the monumental 2016 BTS HYHY epilogue concert at the massive Olympic gymnastics arena so profoundly devastating and historically significant when a deeply exhausted, fiercely proud Yoongi finally spotted his parents sitting in the massive crowd for the very first time. He completely and utterly literally broke down, immediately dropping to his knees and bowing his head completely to the cold stadium floor, sobbing uncontrollably in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans because he had finally, after years of agonizingly painful estrangement and desperate struggle, received the ultimate unspoken parental validation he had been secretly starving for his entire life. Today, when the blinding, chaotic stadium lights finally shut off and the deafening, earth-shattering roar of millions of ecstatic fans is completely replaced by the eerie, incredibly isolating silence of his notoriously private, highly fortified Genius Lab recording studio, the very first thing this intensely introverted, fiercely independent millionaire does is softly reach for his phone to dial his mother's number, seeking the one genuinely pure, entirely uncomplicated connection in a world that constantly demands a piece of his incredibly valuable soul. In those deeply intimate, wonderfully private international phone calls, the notoriously stoic, razor-sharp global superstar entirely strips away his heavy, intimidating August D armor, effortlessly reverting back to just being the quiet, incredibly thoughtful, and deeply loving younger son from Daegu, who just desperately wants to hear his mother's familiar, beautifully heavily accented voice echoing through the receiver from hundreds of miles away. It is absolutely fascinating and hilariously heartwarming to deeply realize that his mother is famously known for perfectly matching and often brilliantly surpassing his own notoriously savage, incredibly witty personality, playfully teasing him about his completely unchanged, deeply ingrained habits, bluntly telling him that he looks like a soft, squishy dumpling on national television, and effortlessly keeping him entirely grounded with her hilariously sharp, deeply affectionate banter that completely ignores his massive, unimaginably staggering net worth and his untouchable godlike status in the global music industry. These incredibly precious, deeply grounding conversations are absolutely non-negotiable for him, whether he has just finished producing a massive, record-breaking, historic collaboration with global legends like Coldplay, Psy, or IU, or he is physically completely drained and mentally agonizingly exhausted from a grueling high-altitude intercontinental flight. Talking to his notoriously witty, deeply loving mother acts as his ultimate, immensely powerful psychological anchor, actively preventing his famously cynical, highly analytical mind from spiraling into the dark, incredibly isolating abyss of unprecedented global fame. Imagine the immense, overwhelmingly profound wave of deep soulful peace and absolute emotional triumphs he must deeply feel now, knowing completely without a single shadow of a doubt that the very same woman who once desperately tore up his fragile lyric notebooks out of pure, terrifyingly primal maternal fear is now proudly operating a widely famous, highly successful restaurant entirely decorated with his massive, record-breaking global achievements, standing firmly as his absolute biggest, most fiercely loyal supporter in the entire universe. Despite having literally conquered the entire global music industry and effortlessly cementing his undisputed historic legacy as one of the greatest, most brilliant musical minds of his generation, he never once takes her incredibly pure, radically unconditional love for granted, actively relying on her deeply grounding, hilariously blunt wisdom to successfully navigate the highly toxic, fiercely treacherous waters of modern superstardom, meticulously ensuring that his massive worldwide success never once corrupts his deeply humble, fiercely authentic, and highly compassionate spirit. The incredibly profound, spectacularly beautiful irony of Min Yoongi's remarkably complex life is that while he constantly projects an incredibly tough, impenetrable, and fiercely independent aura to protect himself from the incredibly cruel, hypercritical scrutiny of the global media, it is ultimately the soft, hilariously savage, deeply nurturing voice of his mother that completely completely melts away his heavy, agonizingly painful scars, quietly providing the incredibly invisible, deeply secure emotional sanctuary that gracefully allows him to bravely bleed his raw, unfiltered emotions into his world-changing music every day. Number 4. J-Hope, the radiant sunshine, the son who danced for his mother's dreams. Have you ever paused to look beyond the blindingly bright, endlessly energetic, and radiantly joyful smile of the man who literally introduces himself as your hope, only to wonder what profound depths of sacrifice and unspeakable maternal love actually built the fiercely strong foundation of his unparalleled global success? We are turning our intense documentary lens toward Jungkook, universally adored and wildly celebrated as J-Hope, the absolute dance captain, the flawlessly precise main dancer, and the vital, irreplaceable rhythmic heartbeat of BTS, a man who effortlessly commands massive, historic festival stages and constantly radiates an intensely infectious, brilliantly warm energy that can instantly illuminate the darkest corners of any stadium on Earth. But hidden right beneath that famously flawless, relentlessly sunny exterior and those unimaginably sharp, gravity-defying dance moves lies a deeply emotional, incredibly tear-jerking origin story of a mother's absolute, unwavering financial and emotional sacrifice that will profoundly shatter your heart and beautifully piece it back together all at once. To genuinely comprehend the sheer devastating emotional gravity of why his late-night, desperately needed international phone calls to his mother are so fundamentally crucial to his very survival in the notoriously grueling, utterly exhausting entertainment industry, we absolutely must travel back in time to the vibrant, historically significant streets of Gwangju, where a young, fiercely passionate street dancer, famously known as Smile Hoya, was desperately trying to carve out a seemingly impossible future in the highly competitive, physically brutal underground hip-hop dance scene. While his father, a highly respected, famously strict high school literature teacher, logically and fiercely opposed this incredibly risky, highly unstable artistic path, strongly preferring a secure academic future for his beloved son, J-Hope's mother chose an entirely different, incredibly heartbreaking route of absolute, unconditional support, bravely stepping up as his sole, fiercely protective shield against the intense, highly skeptical pressures of their traditional environment. She actively chose to work incredibly grueling, agonizingly long hours away from her home, even bravely traveling away to take on extra exhausting jobs just to desperately scrape together enough money to consistently fund his expensive dance academy lessons and completely support his seemingly impossible, fiercely burning dreams. Can you even begin to remotely fathom the immense, overwhelmingly heavy psychological and emotional toll it takes on a highly sensitive, fiercely loving teenage boy to physically watch the very woman who gave him life literally exhaust her own body and drain her own spirit, silently absorbing the incredibly harsh, biting financial struggles of the world just so he could beautifully, freely express himself on a wooden dance floor? This agonizingly painful, deeply inspiring, and profoundly beautiful history is exactly what birthed his absolutely legendary, incredibly raw, and deeply personal solo track titled Mama from the critically acclaimed, historically significant 2016 Wings album, a glorious, deeply emotional song where he bravely, boldly, and publicly poured his entire heart out to the world, joyfully thanking his mother for her unbelievable sacrifices and fiercely declaring that she can finally, proudly lean on him because he has successfully, miraculously become a son who can protect her from the harsh realities of the world. Today, when the explosive, spectacularly blinding fireworks finally fade into the dark night sky and the deafening, earth-shattering roar of 100,000 ecstatic fans at a massive historic solo gig like his unprecedented, critically acclaimed headlining performance at Lollapalooza, affectionately dubbed Hopiepalooza by the fiercely loyal global masses, is completely replaced by the eerie, incredibly isolating silence of a luxurious, heavily guarded Chicago hotel room, the very first entirely reflexive thing this intensely charismatic, multi-millionaire global superstar does is excitedly reach for his phone to dial his mother's number. In those deeply intimate, wonderfully private, and incredibly precious international phone calls, the famously strict, terrifyingly precise dance leader of BTS, who notoriously commands absolute perfection from his incredibly famous members during those grueling 12-hour choreography rehearsals, entirely sheds his heavy, highly responsible professional armor, effortlessly reverting back to just being the sweet, deeply affectionate, and incredibly grateful son from Gwangju, who just desperately needs to hear his mother's familiar, beautifully comforting voice echoing warmly through the receiver from thousands of miles away. It is absolutely fascinating, deeply moving, and incredibly profoundly beautiful to deeply realize that while the rest of the entire global music industry fiercely debates his unparalleled, deeply complex musicality, his jaw-dropping, effortlessly fluid freestyle dance skills, or his absolutely staggering, record-breaking solo achievements on the fiercely competitive Billboard charts, his mother is essentially the one singularly pure, entirely uncomplicated person on the planet who simply genuinely asks if he is eating his meals properly, if he is taking good care of his physical health, and if he is genuinely, authentically happy behind that massively famous, universally recognizable smile. These incredibly precious, deeply grounding, and fiercely protected conversations are absolutely non-negotiable for him, whether he is nervously waiting in a highly chaotic, overwhelmingly loud backstage area at a massive global award show, dealing with the intense, mind-boggling pressure of representing South Korea on an unprecedented, historically monumental scale, or physically entirely drained and mentally agonizing exhausted from a grueling intercontinental promotional tour, talking to his deeply loving, incredibly supportive mother acts as his ultimate, profoundly powerful psychological anchor. It actively, beautifully, and fiercely prevents his famously generous, intensely giving, and highly empathetic spirit from entirely burning out under the immense, completely crushing pressure of constantly having to be the unbreakable, universally beloved sunshine for millions of deeply adoring fans and 6 highly dependent, incredibly famous bandmates. Imagine the immense, overwhelmingly profound wave of deep soulful peace, absolute emotional triumph, and incredible mind-boggling satisfaction he must deeply feel now, knowing completely without a single shadow of a doubt that the very same woman who once desperately, silently struggled to pay his modest dance academy tuition fees is now universally, fundamentally recognized and deeply respected as the undeniably proud mother of a literal history-making cultural icon, a wildly successful, incredibly wealthy man who gracefully, courageously, and flawlessly completed his physically demanding, highly disciplined mandatory military service as an elite, universally respected special forces instructor, completely and utterly shattering any ridiculous, deeply insulting preconceived celebrity stereotypes. Despite literally handing her the entire world on a glittering, diamond-encrusted silver platter and effortlessly cementing his undisputed, historic legacy as one of the most uniquely brilliant, universally respected, and physically gifted performers of his generation, he never ever once takes her incredibly pure, radically unconditional love for granted, actively and constantly relying on her deeply grounding, beautifully simple wisdom to successfully, gracefully navigate the highly toxic, fiercely treacherous, and unbelievably chaotic waters of modern superstardom. Number 3. Jimin, the angelic performer, the sweetest Busan boy. Have you ever stopped to truly, deeply observe the ethereal, almost entirely otherworldly presence of the man who flawlessly executes impossibly delicate, breathtakingly beautiful contemporary dance moves on the world's biggest, most intimidating stages, completely hypnotizing millions of ecstatic fans with just a single, devastatingly intense gaze and a voice that sounds like spun sugar? We are stepping into the intensely emotional, fiercely passionate, and profoundly inspiring world of Park Jimin, the undisputed global it boy, the mesmerizing lead vocalist, and the insanely captivating main dancer of BTS, a man who effortlessly commands massive, historic arenas and constantly radiates an intensely intoxicating, brilliantly alluring energy that can instantly captivate the absolute darkest corners of any stadium on the face of the earth. But hidden right beneath that famously flawless, relentlessly enchanting exterior, those incredibly sharp, gravity-defying spins, and that notoriously devastating stage presence lies a deeply emotional, incredibly tear-jerking origin story of intense self-doubt, unimaginably brutal perseverance, and a mother's absolute unwavering emotional sanctuary that will profoundly shatter your heart and beautifully piece it back together all in the very same breath. To genuinely comprehend the sheer, devastating emotional gravity of why his late-night, desperately needed international phone calls to his mother are so fundamentally crucial to his very survival in the notoriously grueling, utterly exhausting entertainment industry, we absolutely must travel back in time to the vibrant coastal city of Busan, where a young, fiercely passionate, and incredibly prodigious modern dance student was desperately trying to carve out a seemingly impossible future, carrying the incredibly heavy burden of being the top student at the prestigious Busan High School of Arts. When he made the terrifying, life-altering decision to completely abandon his incredibly promising, highly secure future in classical contemporary dance to travel alone to the unfamiliar, highly intimidating city of Seoul to become an idol trainee, he stepped into what would become the absolute darkest, most brutally agonizing period of his entire life, facing a terrifyingly short training period and the constantly looming, heavily suffocating threat of being kicked out of the final debut lineup a staggering total of 8 different times. Can you even begin to remotely fathom the immense, overwhelmingly heavy psychological, physical, and emotional toll it takes on a highly sensitive, fiercely perfectionistic teenage boy to literally sleep for only 2 agonizing hours a night, obsessively practicing the exact same choreography in a cold, dimly lit, completely suffocating practice room until his entire body literally gave out, violently collapsing on the hard wooden floor, while surviving on an impossibly cruel, fiercely dangerous diet of just 1 single meal a day, entirely driven by the absolute paralyzing fear of failing and being sent back home to Busan as a devastating disappointment. Throughout all of this unspeakable physical agony and completely silent, lonely tears, it was his mother's gentle, deeply worried yet unconditionally supportive voice on the other end of the telephone that acted as his sole, desperately needed lifeline, quietly absorbing his massive, heavy anxieties, softly begging him to please eat properly, and fiercely reminding him that regardless of whether he debuted in a massive boy group or just quietly returned home, he was already her absolute perfect, undeniably brilliant son. This agonizingly painful, deeply inspiring, and profoundly beautiful history is exactly what birthed his absolutely legendary, incredibly raw, and deeply personal empathy, transforming him into the immensely caring, famously angelic fairy of BTS, who is always, without fail, the very first person to violently rush forward to hold, comfort, and fiercely embrace any of his 6 immensely famous bandmates the second they shed a tear on stage. Today, when the explosive, spectacularly blinding fireworks finally fade into the dark night sky and the deafening, earth-shattering roar of 100,000 ecstatic fans at a massive historic stadium gig is completely replaced by the eerie, incredibly isolating silence of a luxurious, heavily guarded international hotel room, the very first entirely reflexive thing this intensely charismatic, multi-millionaire global superstar does is excitedly reach for his phone to eagerly dial his mother's number. In those deeply intimate, wonderfully private, and incredibly precious international phone calls, the famously flawless, terrifyingly precise performer who recently completely shattered historic, unprecedented global records by becoming the very first South Korean solo artist in history to ever hit #1 on the fiercely competitive Billboard Hot 100 chart with his incredibly intoxicating masterpiece Like Crazy, entirely sheds his heavy, highly glamorous, untouchable celebrity armor, effortlessly reverting back to just being the sweet, deeply affectionate, and incredibly whiny youngest son from Busan, who just desperately needs to hear his mother's familiar, beautifully comforting voice playfully scolding him for not wearing a thick enough coat during his high-profile International Fashion Week appearances. It is absolutely fascinating, deeply moving, and incredibly profoundly beautiful to deeply realize that while the rest of the entire global music industry fiercely debates his unparalleled, deeply complex vocal color, his jaw-dropping, effortlessly fluid gender-defying fashion, or his absolutely staggering, record-breaking global brand ambassadorships with legendary luxury houses like Dior and Tiffany & Co., his mother is essentially the one singular pure, entirely uncomplicated person on the planet who simply, genuinely asks if his famously bad back is hurting him after all those rigorous, high-intensity performances, if he is actually getting enough restorative sleep, and if he is genuinely, authentically happy behind that massively famous, universally adored eye smile. These incredibly precious, deeply grounding, and fiercely protected conversations are absolutely non-negotiable for him, whether he is nervously waiting in a highly chaotic, overwhelmingly loud backstage area at a massive global award show, dealing with the intense, mind-boggling pressure of constantly having to beautifully maintain his famously perfect, completely unblemished, angelic persona for millions of deeply adoring fans, or physically entirely drained and mentally agonizingly exhausted from his deeply grueling, highly disciplined mandatory military service, where he bravely continues to push his physical limits, talking to his deeply loving, incredibly supportive mother acts as his ultimate, profoundly powerful psychological reset button. It actively, beautifully, and fiercely prevents his notoriously self-critical, intensely overthinking mind from entirely spiraling out of control under the immense, completely crushing pressure of constantly having to be the unbreakable, universally beloved pillar of emotional support for absolutely everyone else around him, finally giving him a safe, incredibly private space where he is allowed to be entirely fragile, completely imperfect, and desperately needy. Imagine the immense, overwhelmingly profound wave of deep, soulful peace, absolute emotional triumph, and incredible, mind-boggling satisfaction he must deeply feel now, knowing completely, without a single shadow of a doubt, that the very same woman who once desperately, silently cried out of pure, terrifying maternal worry while watching him slowly starve himself for a seemingly impossible dream, is now universally, fundamentally recognized and deeply respected as the undeniably proud mother of a literal history-making cultural icon who has brought unparalleled, majestic glory to their hometown and the entire nation of South Korea. Number 2. V. The global fashion icon, the farm boy at heart. Have you ever stopped to truly profoundly marvel at the utterly breathtaking, almost surreal duality of the man who flawlessly commands the entire globe's attention with a single devastatingly intense glance, effortlessly securing his undisputed title as the most handsome face on the planet, while possessing a voice so unbelievably deep, velvety, and soulful that it can instantly soothe the most incredibly broken of hearts? We are diving headfirst into the intensely emotional, fiercely captivating, and beautifully complex world of Kim Tae-young, globally worshipped and fiercely celebrated as V, the undeniably magnetic lead dancer, the extraordinarily gifted baritone vocalist, and the ultimate history-making visual powerhouse of BTS. A man who effortlessly breaks the global internet simply by attending a high-fashion Celine event in Paris, constantly radiating an intensely mysterious, brilliantly alluring aura that makes him seem completely untouchable, almost like a majestic deity descending from the highest heavens. But hidden right beneath that famously flawless, relentlessly enchanting exterior, those incredibly sharp, perfectly sculpted facial features, and that notoriously devastating, deeply intoxicating stage presence, lies a profoundly emotional, incredibly tear-jerking origin story of intense innocence, unimaginably pure family devotion, and a mother's absolute, unwavering, fiercely protective love that will profoundly shatter your heart and beautifully piece it back together, all in the very same fleeting breath. To genuinely comprehend the sheer, devastating emotional gravity of why his late-night, desperately needed international phone calls to his mother are so fundamentally crucial to his very survival in the notoriously grueling, utterly exhausting, and wildly unpredictable entertainment industry, we absolutely must travel back in time to the remarkably quiet, intensely peaceful, and incredibly humble agricultural town of Gachang, where a young, fiercely innocent, and incredibly sweet farm boy honestly believed that his absolute highest destiny in life was to simply inherit his family's modest farm and peacefully cultivate the land. When this beautifully naive, wide-eyed boy suddenly passed a highly competitive big-hit entertainment audition that he only attended to actively support a nervous friend, making the terrifying, life-altering decision to completely uproot his incredibly peaceful, highly secure rural existence to travel entirely alone to the unfamiliar, highly intimidating, and fiercely competitive city of Seoul to become a deeply secretive, entirely hidden idol trainee, he stepped into an overwhelmingly terrifying new universe that threatened to completely swallow his gentle, free-spirited soul whole. Can you even begin to remotely fathom the immense, overwhelmingly heavy psychological, emotional, and social toll it takes on a highly sensitive, fiercely innocent country boy to suddenly find himself surrounded by incredibly stylish, highly sophisticated, and fiercely ambitious city trainees, feeling utterly terrified of being brutally mocked, cruelly bullied, or deeply ostracized for his incredibly humble, significantly less affluent rural background? It was in this incredibly fragile, deeply terrifying moment of agonizing vulnerability that his mother performed an act of such unbelievably pure, fiercely protective maternal sacrifice that it became an absolute legend within the entire global fandom. She fiercely refused to let her precious, wildly talented son feel even slightly inferior in the massive, intimidating capital city, so she desperately scraped together a wildly exorbitant amount of hard-earned money to buy him a ridiculously expensive, massively oversized bright red designer jacket, desperately hoping that the wealthy Seoul kids would mistakenly think he was incredibly rich and absolutely refuse to look down on him. The spectacularly beautiful, incredibly hilarious irony of this deeply moving, profoundly tear-jerking sacrifice is that his future bandmates genuinely believed he was a spoiled, outrageously wealthy heir because of that very same flashy jacket, entirely unaware of the immensely heavy, deeply poignant maternal love, the profound financial struggle, and the fierce protective tears that were invisibly woven into every single thread of that bright red fabric. Today, when the explosive, spectacularly blinding pyrotechnics finally fade into the dark night sky, and the deafening, earth-shattering roar of 100,000 ecstatic fans at a massive, historic stadium gig is completely replaced by the eerie, incredibly isolating silence of a luxurious, heavily guarded international hotel room in the heart of New York or London. The very first entirely reflexive thing this intensely charismatic, multi-millionaire global superstar does is excitedly reach for his phone to eagerly dial his incredibly beloved mother's number. In those deeply intimate, wonderfully private, and incredibly precious international phone calls, the famously flawless, terrifyingly mesmerizing performer who recently completely shattered historic, unprecedented global records with his stunningly beautiful, critically acclaimed solo album Layover, entirely sheds his heavy, highly glamorous, untouchable celebrity armor, effortlessly reverting just back to being the sweet, deeply affectionate, and incredibly pure-hearted farm boy from Gachang, who just desperately needs to hear his familiar, beautifully comforting voice warmly echoing through the receiver. It is absolutely fascinating, deeply moving, and incredibly profoundly beautiful to deeply realize that while the rest of the entire global music industry fiercely debates his unparalleled, deeply complex musicality, his jaw-dropping, effortlessly fluid acting skills, or his absolutely staggering, record-breaking global brand ambassadorships with legendary luxury houses like Cartier and Celine, his mother is essentially the one singularly pure, entirely uncomplicated person on the planet who simply genuinely asks if he has lovingly fed his notoriously famous, wildly adored Pomeranian Yonton today, if he is eating enough incredibly warm, highly comforting home-cooked meals, and if his famously gentle, wildly eccentric, and deeply artistic spirit is genuinely, authentically happy behind that massively famous, universally adored rectangular smile. These incredibly precious, deeply grounding, and fiercely protected conversations are absolutely non-negotiable for him. Whether he is nervously waiting in a highly chaotic, overwhelmingly loud backstage area at a massive global award show, dealing with the intense, mind-boggling pressure of constantly having to beautifully maintain his famously perfect, completely unblemished global visual persona for millions of deeply adoring fans, or physically entirely exhausted and mentally agonizingly exhausted from his deeply grueling, highly disciplined mandatory military service, where he bravely chose to join the exceptionally rigorous Special Task Force, talking to his deeply loving, incredibly supportive mother acts as his ultimate, profoundly powerful psychological reset button. It actively, beautifully, and fiercely prevents his notoriously unique, intensely imaginative, and wildly creative mind from entirely burning out under the immense, completely crushing pressure of constantly having to be the unbreakable, universally beloved, and heavily scrutinized fashion icon of the modern era, finally giving him a highly secure, incredibly private space where he is allowed to be entirely vulnerable, completely unfiltered, and desperately childish. Imagine the immense, overwhelmingly profound wave of deep, soulful peace, absolute emotional triumph, and incredible, mind-boggling satisfaction he must deeply feel now, knowing completely without a single shadow of a doubt that the very same woman who once desperately, silently worried about him being brutally mocked for his humble countryside origins is now universally, fundamentally recognized and deeply respected as the undeniably proud mother of a literal, history-making cultural titan who has completely dominated the global fashion and music industries with an effortless, breathtaking grace. Number 1. Jungkook, the golden maknae, the baby who conquered the world. Have you ever stopped to truly, profoundly comprehend the unimaginable, almost suffocating weight of being globally crowned as the undisputed golden maknae, the absolute prodigious center and the flawless main pop vocalist of the biggest, most monumental music phenomenon in modern human history, all while having practically spent your entire formative adolescence growing up in the incredibly chaotic, heavily scrutinized, and notoriously unforgiving glare of the blinding public eye? We are finally culminating our deeply emotional, tear-jerking journey with Jungkook, the incredibly tattooed, fiercely charismatic man who effortlessly shatters Spotify streaming records into a million pieces, single-handedly brings the entire world to a breathtaking, awe-inspiring standstill with his historic, unimaginably massive FIFA World Cup opening ceremony performance, and consistently dominates the incredibly fierce Billboard charts with his critically acclaimed, brilliantly crafted solo album, Golden. Yet right beneath those heavily inked sleeves, the remarkably sharp, perfectly chiseled jawline, and the aggressively powerful, fiercely stage-commanding presence that makes millions of fans entirely lose their minds, lies a profoundly tender, incredibly pure, and deeply tear-jerking origin story of unimaginable maternal trust, profound physical separation, and a deeply beautiful, unbreakable familial bond that will absolutely shatter your heart and piece it back together in the exact same breath. To genuinely grasp the sheer, devastating emotional magnitude of why his incredibly precious, desperately needed international phone calls to his deeply beloved mother are so fundamentally critical to his very psychological survival in the ruthlessly exhausting, highly toxic entertainment industry, we absolutely must travel back in time to the vibrant, beautiful coastal city of Busan, where a very young, incredibly shy, and intensely sensitive boy was being fiercely raised by a famously bold, incredibly energetic mother. His mother is famously known within the global fandom for her fiercely confident, incredibly charismatic personality, hilariously confessing on national television that she was actually the one who boldly hit on his father first, simply because he was unbelievably handsome, a uniquely bold, wonderfully rebellious trait that perfectly explains where Jungkook inherited his own fiercely competitive, undeniably magnetic, and wildly passionate spirit. She was also incredibly strict about his core morals, famously delivering a severe, unforgettable scolding when a young, highly impressionable Jungkook foolishly attempted to cheat on a simple school spelling test, fiercely drilling into his young mind that genuine, unshakable honesty and raw, authentic integrity were infinitely more valuable than achieving a perfect, flawless score on a piece of paper. Imagine being this fiercely protective, deeply loving mother and having to make the utterly agonizing, unimaginably terrifying decision to pack your incredibly shy, deeply introverted 13-year-old baby boy onto a high-speed train, sending him entirely alone to the massive, highly intimidating, and fiercely competitive capital city of Seoul to chase a dangerously uncertain, highly volatile idol dream. Can you even begin to remotely fathom the immense, overwhelmingly heavy psychological and emotional toll it took on her fiercely devoted motherly heart to know that her precious youngest son, who notoriously used to desperately wait until all the other older trainees had completely fallen deeply asleep just so he could quietly sneak into the cramped, cold dormitory bathroom to desperately shower while violently sobbing out of pure, agonizing homesickness, was miles away, fiercely battling the incredibly cruel pressures of the brutal trainee world completely alone. It was in those incredibly dark, terribly isolating early days when a highly overwhelmed, deeply timid young Jungkook would desperately call her late at night, his tiny voice violently cracking with intense anxiety and profound loneliness, that she had literally had to swallow her own devastating, agonizing tears, fiercely suppressing her powerful, primal maternal urge to simply run all the way to Seoul, grab him tightly, and bring him back to the absolute safety and warmth of his childhood bedroom. Instead, she actively chose a much more difficult path, bravely becoming his ultimate, unshakable emotional bedrock, quietly absorbing his massive, heavy anxieties through the incredibly fragile phone receiver, softly whispering incredibly comforting words of unyielding encouragement, and fiercely trusting his 6 older, highly protective bandmates to actively help raise him, effectively sacrificing her own precious, irreplaceable time with her youngest baby boy so that he could miraculously blossom into a literal global titan who belongs to the entire world. Today, when the explosive, spectacularly blinding stadium pyrotechnics finally fade into the incredibly dark night sky and the deafening, earth-shattering roar of 100,000 ecstatic fans is completely replaced by the eerie, incredibly isolating silence of a massive, heavily guarded luxury penthouse suite in Los Angeles, London, or Tokyo, the very first entirely reflexive thing this intensely charismatic, multi-millionaire global superstar does is excitedly reach for his smartphone to eagerly dial his incredibly beloved mother's number. In those deeply intimate, wonderfully private, and incredibly precious international phone calls, the notoriously flawless, terrifyingly powerful performer who completely redefined modern pop music entirely sheds his heavy, highly glamorous, untouchable celebrity armor, effortlessly reverting back to just being the sweet, deeply affectionate, and incredibly whiny youngest son from Busan, who absolutely loves playfully bantering with his deeply loving parents using his highly endearing, incredibly comforting hometown Satori dialect. It is absolutely fascinating, deeply moving, and incredibly profoundly beautiful to deeply realize that while the rest of the entire global music industry fiercely debates his unparalleled, deeply complex vocal agility, his jaw-dropping, effortlessly fluid, fiercely aggressive dance skills, or his absolutely staggering, historic global brand ambassadorships with iconic luxury houses like Calvin Klein, his mother is essentially the one singularly pure, entirely uncomplicated person on the planet who simply genuinely asks if he has lovingly fed and properly walked his wildly famous, fiercely adored Doberman Bam, if he is actually eating enough warm, highly comforting home-cooked meals instead of constantly relying on late-night delivery food, and if he is genuinely, authentically happy and taking care of his famously fragile, deeply artistic spirit behind that massively famous, universally adored bunny smile. These incredibly precious, deeply grounding, and fiercely protected conversations are absolutely non-negotiable for him, whether he is nervously waiting in a highly chaotic, overwhelmingly loud backstage area at massive, historically significant global award shows, dealing with the intense, mind-boggling pressure of constantly having to beautifully maintain his famously perfect, completely unblemished golden persona for millions of deeply adoring, intensely passionate fans, or physically entirely drained and mentally agonizingly exhausted from his deeply grueling, highly disciplined mandatory military service where he bravely continues to push his intense, superhuman physical limits as an elite, exceptionally dedicated soldier. Talking to his deeply loving, incredibly supportive mother acts as his ultimate, profoundly powerful psychological reset button. It actively, beautifully, and fiercely prevents his notoriously relentless, intensely competitive, and wildly perfectionistic mind from entirely burning out under the immense, completely crushing pressure of constantly having to be the unbreakable, universally beloved pop icon of the modern era, finally giving him a highly secure, incredibly private space where he is absolutely allowed to be entirely vulnerable, completely unfiltered, desperately childish, and completely free from the suffocating expectations of the entire planet.